Fate, Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 34-35. Chapter 34, Planning for Problems. It's a jousting spear. It's supposed to be big. Gareth explained to the group, a small frown on her face. It was gifted to me by Merlin. Although he called it, gun lance. Gun lance. Vrindari tilted his head and looked to Arash. What is a gun? Firearm. Arash explained, then shrugged, isn't as skilled as using a bow. Vrindari stayed silent, still having no clue what a gun was, although was able to discern that it was a projectile weapon of some variety. Perhaps it was like a crossbow. Either way, why was it called that? It explodes. Gareth explained, whenever I hit someone with it and the recoil stops my momentum. So, you are carrying a ballista on your arm that does not shoot bolts. Well, no. Maybe. She frowned. Merlin didn't really explain it to me that well. Who is this Merlin? The quartermaster. Oh, no. Gareth shook her head. He was King Arthur's court mage. Although, she frowned, I wasn't that comfortable around him. Arash snorted, shaking his head. Court mage. Vrindari titled his head. King Vendrick had Esser Velstadt, although I doubt he would count as a court mage in the term you would use. What was he then? A cleric. Arash furrowed his brows, like a priest. Wouldn't have expected a priest to be granted knighthood. He shrugged, then again, some priests are actually pretty capable warriors, so I suppose I shouldn't judge. No, for his strength alone, Esser Velstadt made the presence of clerics tolerable. Vrindari explained, and one would be foolish to challenge him to combat. That good, There was only one other besides King Vendrick himself who could challenge him. Vrindari sighed. They fought only once, and it was close. Who? Gareth asked. Esser Rame. The knight I squired under. Vrindari chuckled. Esser Rame was one of the finest knights in the king's court. His skill with his blade was second to none and he had strength to spare. Esser Velstadt was every bit Esser Rame's equal, and that was when he was armed with a talisman for a weapon. He shook his head, a belt-turned warhammer. Intimidation as much as anything else. Sounds. Gareth searched for the right words. Loud. It was. Vrindari gave a quiet chuckle. It was very loud. He looked over to Gareth. You look young enough. Who did you squire under? Ah. Gareth beamed. Sir Lancelot. He was the strongest knight on the round table. Well, Big Brother Gawain could match his strength under the sun, but Lancelot didn't have those kind of blessings. So I did my best to support him as a fellow member of the Round Table. Round Table. Vrindari tilted his head. It was the knights who served under King Arthur. Gareth explained, although, they are all stronger than me. Ash looks just like Big Brother Gawain too. Does he? Vrindari shrugged. How curious, still. You seem to have a great adoration for this, Sir Lancelot. Yeah, Arash nodded, a small frown on his face, even now. Gareth winced, no doubt realizing what the archer was referring to. Why yeah. He was the one who conferred the title of knight to me. She nodded her head, giving a small smile. In truth, he's the ideal sort of knight I wanted to become. Arash stared at her for a few moments. Well, I'm sure you'll get there eventually. He smiled at her. You try your hardest, kid. I'll be rooting for you to become a great knight. Yes. Gareth beamed, then paused, turning back to Vrindari. Just out of curiosity, were there any other knights in your kingdom? My predecessor. Vrindari replied, Esser Sion, from what I learned. He was neither the strongest knight, the fastest, sturdiest or most skilled. But, Esser Rame had nothing but praise for him. Of all the knights, there will never be one more loyal than Esser Sion, he would often say. Sounds a bit like Bedivere. Gareth smiled. Did you ever meet him? No. To my regret I did not. Vrindari sighed. It was the opening days of the war with the giants. Esser Sion led the advance party into their lands. He and his men were killed in an ambush while they slept. Oh, that's a dishonorable end for a man who deserved better. He scoffed. I was a common soldier at the time, but the rage of King Vendrick at Esser Sion's death was felt far across the kingdom. He led the war himself from that point, crossing the sea and razing the giant's kingdom to the ground. What was your king like? King Vendrick. Vrindari looked up. He was the strongest warrior in the kingdom. He and his brother built the kingdom of Drangleic with their own hands, as my king the first would always stand by his side. He would act in the best interests of the kingdom, although if I had one grievance. At the very end, his heart led him astray. Fell in love, did he? Arash guessed. Vrindari nodded slowly. With a witch. The two blinked. I had always suspected her, but she was the king's beloved. I made no comment. Esser Rame did. He rubbed the bridge of his helmet. Esser Rame had always told me that true loyalty was to adhere not to your king's commands, but his best interests. So, he felt that Nashandra was manipulating the king witch. I realize now, she was. What did he do? He denounced her as a witch in front of the court and demanded her exile. Vrindari let out a tired sigh. Esser Velstadt, his loyalty to King Vendrick was without question, as Nashandra was queen, an insult to her was an insult to the king. Oh, Gareth frowned. They fought, didn't they? For 3 hours they jeweled in the throne room without rest. Vrindari rested his head in his hands. By the end, Esser Rame was beaten and exiled. Thus the kingdom began its descent, the only vocal member of Nashandra's opposition gone. She was free to act as she pleased, and through it all. I remained silent. Sir Lancelot fell in love with the queen. Gareth blurted out. Sir Igravain set up a trap to expose him and Sir Lancelot killed him. Then at the queen's mock execution, Sir Lancelot killed me and my brother Gaheris. Still you admire him. Vrindari tilted his head. Do you still admire Sir Rame? Vrindari chuckled. Esser Rame did not fall in love with a witch, but he was branded a traitor to the throne. The night of treachery. It is a cruel twist of fate that the works of great kings can be undone by a simple matter of the heart, he muttered. Don't know much about love. Arash shrugged his shoulders, but it's definitely got its impacts. Good and bad. What was your king like? King Arthur was, Gareth smiled. They were the greatest king. He worked to build an ideal kingdom, was the strongest in the kingdom and worked to save it. Well, Gareth beamed. It was a true honor to be a knight in his court. Vrindari nodded his head slowly. I would argue that Vendrick was the greater king. Gareth stilled slowly turning to the taller knight with a challenging look in her eyes. King Arthur was better, they were part dragon. King Vendrick slew giants. So did King Arthur. But did they lead a war against a kingdom of giants? No. They had Excalibur. What is that? A sword. Arash explained, chuckling as he watched the two knights bicker. Well. A really famous sword. Vendrick nodded. Did it do anything? Wipe out a fortress in a single swing. Vrindari's shoulders slumped. There was a sword that did that. Oh, yeah. Arash nodded his head. A nasty thing to be on the receiving end of too. Gareth blinked, turning to Arash. You met King Arthur. Previous summon. He explained. Grail War in Tokyo. He cringed, little hazy. Think something happened to me there, although I don't think I could forget that sword in a hurry. A smile came across his face. Well, there was his master as well. Young girl with glasses, he snickered. I think he might have gotten a little friendly with that one. Gareth blinked, then gaped like a fish. King Arthur. You're talking about King Arthur, right? Well, Arash paused. Saber from another world or something. He shrugged. Timelines are confusing. King Arthur, Gareth was still mumbling. Does this mean I'd have to call her queen if I ever met her? She blinked. Or auntie-in-law. Auntie. Oh yeah. Arash blew air through his mouth. Most of the knights of the Round Table were related to each other, well. Half of them were. He shrugged. I see. Vrindari nodded slowly. Well. I assume they were competent. Yep. Wouldn't be a stretch to say that any and all of the knights of the Round Table is a top-class servant. Vrindari slowly turned his head to stare at Gareth, the young knight still mumbling about Arthur and a girl other than the queen, before he turned his attention back to the archer. Any and all. Any and all. Arash confirmed with a grin. Beatrice and Pontiff Sullivan Pav. You make catalysts, out of twigs and, Sullivan held up the catalyst to his face, examining it fully. Is that a copper coin? Yes. Beatrice nodded, then winced when he turned to look at her. I didn't have a lot of materials in the wilds. I see. Sullivan looked back over the catalyst, humming to himself. It is adequate work, far more so than I would have expected. Most heretic sorcerers originated in Vinheim and still relied on the catalysts they made in the workshops. I have not seen one crafted from mundane materials. Well, Beatrice shrugged, I went through a lot of them. Tended to get damaged in fights. Where did you say you were from? Lordran. Oh, you are quite ancient, aren't you? Sullivan chuckled, although your appearance is now understandable. Big Hat Logan, I believe. Well, he and Seath did invent sorcery, so I wanted to, well, pay my respects to him. I have no concern with homage to Logan or Seath. Crafting a source of power from wisdom rather than something as dubious and manipulative as faith, it earned my respect. He handed the catalyst back to her. More importantly, I am curious as to why you were a witch in the wilds, as opposed to a reject from Vinheim. Mother raised me like that. Beatrice explained, she had choice words for the scholars there. Perceptive woman. Sullivan grunted, regardless, there was nothing to stop you joining them. The courts had a tendency to admit savages, for the purpose of civilizing them. Beatrice shuffled on the spot. They wouldn't like what I studied. Oh. Sullivan tilted his head. And what did you study? The abyss. Oh. Yes, I can see they would take issue with that. Sullivan chuckled. Yes, it was especially frowned upon after the flooding of New Londo and the fall of Ulasil. He leaned in towards her. Tell me, why did you hope to study the abyss? No one knew anything about it. Beatrice whined. They always spoke about how evil it was and how it would corrupt, but they never offered anything even remotely close to actual evidence. Sorcery could just as easily drive one insane. So I wanted to study the abyss myself because no one else would. Sullivan interlocked his fingers, his wooden facial cheeks let out a subtle groan as they moved upwards, giving the impression of a smile. If no one else will see the truth, they you would. Well, Beatrice fidgeted on the spot, looking away from him. I wanted to. I died on my journey to the abyss itself. Unfortunate. Sullivan sighed, although, there were many who dabbled in the abyss, perhaps you will encounter one. Oh, I already have. Beatrice grinned, and I have so many questions and studies and tests to run. It's exciting, a pity is a pyromancy and not a sorcery, but it's good enough. Abyssal pyromancy. And who would? Sullivan paused, then chuckled quietly, the unkindled one, I assume. Who? Beatrice blinked, then widened her eyes and made an, oh expression, oh, you mean Ash. Yes. Ash, you say. A fitting name. Sullivan muttered, and he uses the abyss. How interesting. Isn't it? Beatrice cackled, I have the opportunity to see the abyss up close. You encountered the accursed, did you not? Sullivan asked, the beasts, made from bodies. Why yes. She cringed. That was a bit closer to the abyss than I would have liked and isn't really that controlled. On the contrary. The caster countered, that is a use that requires great skill. Aldrich was smart and skilled enough to craft the beasts and ensure they obeyed his commands. Of course, my own creations could do much the same, but Aldrich was able to have his infused with the deep. He chuckled, they are called the accursed, for a reason. They curse people. Beatrice guessed. Sullivan stared at her for a few moments before he sighed. Indeed. Sullivan grumbled. They are. The clanging of metal had the pair turn their heads to the open window. Sullivan sighed, rising from his chair and moving over to the open window and staring out at the courtyard. Mindless brutes. He grunted. Beatrice followed him to the window and looked outside. Vrindari and Gareth were in the middle of a sparring match. Arash sat at the sidelines with an amused smile on his face while Sif lay down on the ground near him. The wolf stared at the pair with a rather bored look in its eyes. Knights remain the same regardless of era, I see. The caster huffed in annoyance. Still, it would be best I return to my work. I suspect the unkindled will be here soon, and tempting fate is not something I have planned. With that, he turned on his heel and retreated through the palace corridors. Vrindari, Arash and Gareth Pav. The looking glass knight grunted as the lance slammed into his shield. An explosion of blue light originating from the weapon had him take a step back. Gareth pursued him, only to see he had done so to build up momentum before he slammed his shield forwards. Gareth raised her own kite shield to absorb the blow, letting out a small gasp of air as she skipped back with the attack and landed on her feet. Impressive. Vrindari nodded his head. For one so young, you display some skill. Well, I was the seventh seat of the round table. Gareth smirked. I was also trained by the best knights. But did their lessons remain, is the question to be answered. Vrindari replied, lowering his body and assuming his stance. It is one thing to be skilled at jousting, however when you are bereft of your mount is the true test. Gareth met his challenge with a wry smile. I passed every test to become a knight. She cocked her own lance back. I can pass this one. We shall see. Vrindari replied, then advanced on her. Gareth shot forth like a missile, disappearing from her spot and clearing the space between the two of them in an instant, thrusting her lance forwards towards Vrindari's shield. The knight slammed his mirror shield into her lance, then pushed it upwards, parrying the blow before he thrust his sword forwards. Gareth used her agility to avoid the strike before moving again, detonating her lance and causing Vrindari to stumble to the side, slightly off balance. Vrindari grunted, then slammed his shield down, kicking up a small cloud of dirt in Gareth's face. The lancer spit dirt out of her mouth, then looked up as an armored fist parted the cloud of dirt in front of her, aimed at her face. She narrowed her eyes and lifted her own shield to block the strike, her feet leaving the ground as she allowed the blow to carry her back a few meters before she landed back down, leaving imprints of her boots in the dirt. Vrindari retracted his fist, then moved to grip the handle of his blade and ripped it from the ground where he had stabbed it. You aren't that bad. Gareth chuckled. Despite my ranking of being a Esser, I was only a captain in the king's army. Vrindari replied, I could never hope to match Esser Rame or Esser Velstadt. He sighed, and it appears you were trained well. I was trained by the best. You were trained by the best in your kingdom. Vrindari countered, I would withhold the claim of being trained by the most skilled until I see your Sir Lancelot, dual Esser Rame. Gareth pouted, shaking her head. Well, Sir Lancelot would still win. Vrindari absently hummed in response before he advanced on the knight again. PFF'd. Arash shook his head. Knights. It's like watching children fight. He looked down at Sif. I suppose you would argue that the knight you served was the best. Sif's snout curled into a slight smile, an amused look in his eyes and a curt nod. Arash rolled his eyes at the wolf. Well, if he was good enough to teach a wolf how to swing a sword, I'd probably not want to get close to him. Sif's smirk seemed to get wider. Arash-san. He turned his head, smiling at the new arrival. Hey, Mash. You're up early. Well, she looked over at Vrindari and Gareth still sparring. I heard a small commotion and thought to investigate. No attacks to worry about so far. Lancelot is better. I merely state that Esser Rame is more skilled until I see otherwise. Well, Arash chuckled as the arguments became slightly louder. No attacks of a physical kind anyway. I think they might be fighting over professional pride in their teachers. Oh. Mash let out a small laugh. Are they going to be alright? They'll be fine. Arash reassured her. Despite everything else, knights know how to hold back. I think. He paused. Well, I assume they do. What with all the squires and spars they used to have. A scoff drew the attention of the pair to Quelaag as she scuttled over to them with a scowl on her face directed at the two knights. Those two meatheads. A growl drew her attention over to Sif, the wolf narrowing its eyes at her. Ryder rolled her own in response. I'm not planning anything, mutt. Sif huffed and looked away, laying back down on the ground as Fu jumped on his head again. What is that thing anyway? Quelaag asked with a raised eyebrow. Mash and Arash blinked and stared at each other, then at Fu. Don't know. The archer shrugged. I thought it was some kind of familiar. Fu. Mash explained with a strained look. He just goes wherever he wants. So what brings you here? Arash asked with a raised eyebrow. You don't really seem the type to look for conversation, so offense. Quelaag huffed. I either distract myself with conversation from the two of you, who are tolerable, or I get glared at by the honorable fools, questioned by some hermit which are mocked by a half-tree. She gave Arash a dull look, and that is only for this morning, without having to contend with the scornful gaze of the human populace. Are you all right, Quelaag-san? Mash asked with a concerned expression. The witch turned to her with an incredulous expression before she let out a mirthless laugh. If you looked like me, would you be alright? Mash didn't give an answer, looking down. I thought as much. She huffed, shaking her head. Then again, I don't have anyone else to blame for it, she muttered bitterly. The three fell into a rather awkward silence before Mash spoke up again. Does it hurt? Hurt. Quelaag raised an eyebrow, then cocked her head to the side. Suppose I told you it was agony, that it felt like my skin burned and that every waking moment of my life was nothing but a sensory experience of pain. Would you look at me with pity? More than that, what would you do? What could you do? Mash opened her mouth to speak, then snapped it shut, looking away with a small flinch. Arash frowned and turned to Quelaag with a disapproving expression. There's not need for that. He chided, the little lady was just expressing her concern for you. She shouldn't be concerned. Quelaag huffed, she's got better things to do with her time. Why? Arash asked, tilting his head to the side and raising an eyebrow. There's nothing wrong with showing concern for an ally. We're allies of convenience. The writer scoffed, we aren't exactly friends or comrades. Well, if you say so. Arash shrugged, way I see it, anyone willing to fight by my side deserves a certain amount of respect. I think that the metal-clad fool over there, she raised a mocking finger in Vrindari's direction, and that foolish undead who follows you around like a stray dog would disagree. Vrindari-san is concerned. Mash replied with a strained expression, knowing full well he had blatantly admitted his dislike of the woman several times, and Ash-san is, she paused, he hates you. He more likely hates my family. She scoffed, although he isn't exactly unique in that notion, I have certain members I don't like either. Maybe you should give them time. Mash replied, I'm sure they'll warm up to you eventually. Warm up. Quelaag narrowed her eyes at her, is that some kind of joke? Is it because I'm some fire demon, is that it? No. Mash exclaimed, her eyes wide and frantically shaking her arms around. It's an expression. I didn't mean to, I wasn't. PFF'd. Quelaag snorted, a mirthful laugh escaping her throat as she gave Mash a mocking grin. Your face, she shook her head, laugh dying down. You really are a terrible knight, aren't you? Getting flustered and apologizing to the likes of me. Guess she's warmed up to you already, Mash. Arash gave the shielder a thumbs up. Good work. I've not warmed up to her. Quelaag scoffed, she is simply preferable company. Arash gave the writer a teasing grin, causing the woman to click her tongue and look away with a scowl. Nero, Ritska and Olga Pav. Then they have created a border across Gaul. Olga asked, a frown on her face. I did not think they could advance that far. Unfortunately so. Nero gave a grave nod in response. The Gaulish territories were hit the worst, it originated further north initially. Word of spiders wiping out settlements in the dead of night. She waved her hand. At first it was dismissed as nonsense. She sighed, then we lost Colonia Agrippa, after that it was a retreat back to our original territories. That fast. Olga bit her lip, cupping her chin, that doesn't seem possible. If they had the Holy Grail, it would. Romani's screen popped up, his face set in a thoughtful expression. If they were tapping into the ley lines to fuel the summoning of the spiders, it would also explain the interference across Europe. You are the mages. Nero shrugged, you would likely understand this more than me. It was only when we started receiving aid from the good Knight Solaire and the Pontiff that we were able to create a border. Since then, we have been locked in a stalemate for some weeks. We would need to advance to the heart of this, right? Ritska suggested, but, he frowned, what do they want with the Grail? Summoning spiders doesn't seem to be, he cringed, much of an end goal. We know little about the enemy servants. Olga crossed her arms, one is an insane knight, one is an unknown and another is regarded as a saint. Saint. Nero tilted her head, what is that? Ritska blinked, figure of religious importance. Oh, I see. Nero nodded, some barbarian title then. Quote. Yes. Romani gave a hesitant answer, continuing on from Ritska's point, that is exactly what it is. He shook his head, what information we have on Aldrich came from Ash and he only fought him and heard rumors. So, Olga cupped her chin, we need to speak with Sullivan. Regarding what? The voice of the caster echoed through the room as he entered, casting the group a glance. Information, I assume. Saint Aldrich. Olga explained. We need information on him, now. His motives, goals and what we might expect when we confront him. Demanding, aren't you? Sullivan chuckled. However, I have dedicated myself to aiding you. I shall explain what I know, but I will need specifics. He folded his arms behind his back. Ask. What did he want? Romani asked. We know he's doing something that requires a lot of magical energy. He's virtually draining the ley lines, so what would he hope to achieve? A magical experiment, you say? Sullivan mused. Aldrich is a saint of the deep. It is where he drew his knowledge from and where he drew his power. He paused, initially at least. In regards to his goals, he wanted to bring about an era of dark seas, believing he would need to be the ultimate form of life to exist within it. Quote. So, what does that actually mean? Ritska asked. Sullivan sighed. It means, boy, that Aldrich is likely attempting to open up a doorway into the abyss. Quote. None of you have any idea what I refer to, do you? He made a clicking sound akin to one of annoyance, typical. He is going to force open the realm of humanity, at least enough to gorge himself. He shrugged. From there, he will likely supplant himself as a lord to be worshipped. That's, Ritska blinked. How do you know all that? Despite whatever Aldrich may claim, his motivations are simple to grasp. Sullivan replied with a wave of his hands. It also served my purpose when I was in his employ. This means nothing. Olga threw up her hands. Abyss, realm of humanity, you keep using terms that mean absolutely nothing to anyone other than you. Nero nodded along. Pale rose. Olga cringed at the nickname. Speaks truly. Explain it to us in Latin, please. Ritska and Romani blinked and stared at each other in equal levels of incredulity at that sentence being uttered. The soul, then. Sullivan sighed. You've likely never tapped into it, or rather without the first flame, it was never found for you. He shrugged. It matters little. Without the first flame to balance the scales, the soul of man will run rampant unless properly controlled. And what does the soul of man do, exactly? Olga asked with narrowed eyes and an irritated tone of voice. Grants power. He answered immediately. You've already seen its results. The beasts composed of corpses. Those things. Ritska cringed. There's no way that the soul of people could be that. Sullivan chuckled. A low and amused sound. Arguably, those beasts are more human than I. Although they are power alone, attack dogs for Aldrich in the same vein that the Outrider Knights were for me. Fine. Olga sighed. So, he is attempting to open up a doorway into another realm. It is the soul of primeval man. Olga suddenly tensed. The wording of that particular sentence had her furrowing her brows. Would you describe it as an existence outside the world which is a reflection of the caster? And this abyss you speak of is tied to the soul. What an apt way of putting it. Sullivan mused. You grasped it quickly. You are familiar with it. Olga bit her lip, looking away into Romani. That sounds like a reality marble. Romani crossed his arms. But an independent reality marble perhaps. Or a shared one tied to human souls. No. Olga shook her head. That would tie it to Alaya, but if it is a part of the will of humanity. This caster is trying to create a gateway into a form of Alaya then, she gripped her hair. That's very terrible. Well, Ritska gave a nervous chuckle. We've sort of established that, director. Not in his petty quest for godhood, you imbecile. Olga hissed. You don't just go ripping open doors to the will of mankind in any capacity. She sighed. This is the one instance where the incineration of humanity is working to benefit us, she muttered. Ritska blinked at her and furrowed his brows. How? Because otherwise, we'd be dead. She bluntly put. With mankind gone, the will of humanity is weaker than it would be otherwise, meaning they can't deploy any counter-guardians to kill us all. Quote. Oh. Ritska nodded his head. I have no idea what that is. The director took in a sharp intake of breath before she let out a long and pained sigh. When we return to Chaldea, you are going to be properly informed. Understood. Yes, director. Ritska nodded, somewhat thankful that he was finally going to be able to understand something about the magical world. For now. Olga turned back around. Our priority remains finding where the enemy caster has cemented himself. Aldrich will have secured himself in a fortress. Sullivan explained. You will need a map of old citadels and descriptions of them. So, Ritska turned to Sullivan. Not that I'm not grateful, but why are you helping us? He flinched when Sullivan turned his head to face him. And no offense but, you did sort of work with him, so why would you help us now? Aldrich acts in any way that will make him powerful. Sullivan replied, if burning away the world and making himself king of the ashes would make him the strongest being on the planet, he would do so. My goal has always been to progress the world at a natural pace. If it took my own direction, then I would do so without hesitation. I would kill thousands if it meant history would progress. I worked with Aldrich because our goals of bringing about the end of the Age of Fire coincided. So, you're assisting us because you don't want history to stagnate. Olga surmised. Sullivan gave her a slow nod. I am. He straightened himself. Do not misunderstand. We are allies of shared goals, nothing more. If it was necessary to burn away this continent for the progression of history and to bring about the next age, in whatever form it would take, then I would be the first one to place the kindling. Well, Ritska coughed into his fist. That's nice. HMPH. The caster grunted, looking over at Nero. You have maps of the territories, do you not? We do. Romani spoke up. There are a few, but the interference blankets the whole of Europe, save the current Roman borders. He sighed, we can't tell you whereabouts in Europe Aldrich is working from, you'd need to cover the entire region. Nero nodded, then puffed out her chest. Then that is what we shall do. Romani blinked. Hang on a say. She pointed at Fujimaru. You are now tribune. She grinned. Congratulations on being blessed by the Emperor of Rome. Ritska stuttered. Wait, you can't just. Olga went to intervene, eyes wide at the sudden promotion of her subordinate when Nero rounded on her with an even wider grin. And as his leader, I shall appoint you the rank of prefect. Her eyes sparkled. I cannot grant you the title of legate, because you have yet to face combat, but I am certain you shall rise to the challenge. Wow. Romani blinked, then chuckled. Congratulations, director. Or do you want me to call you prefect now? Romani. Olga frowned at him. Refer to me as director. She sighed, and this is too unreal. She mumbled under her breath. Congratulations. Sullivan nodded to her. You are now a victim of nepotism. Now, we should. He paused, turning his head and staring down at the floor. A symbolic language carved itself into the ground and began glowing. Was not expecting a commune from the Sunlight Warrior. He grumbled, then placed his hand on it. Oh, so this is how Solaire spoke with you then. Ritska muttered under his breath, watching as the glowing transparent form of Solaire emerged from the writing, turning to face them. Ah, my friend. Solaire spoke in a joyful tone of voice as he caught sight of Ritska. I see you made it to Rome safely. He nodded, that is good news indeed. The sun is most kind in its blessings. Nero grinned. You have news, Prefect Solaire. The man's shoulders dropped. I am afraid. Forum Claudii Valentium has been abandoned, we have been forced into retreat. What? Nero exclaimed in shock. How? What occurred to warrant this? I dispatched Legate Vespasian and the 6th Legion to reinforce you. They attacked during the night. Solaire explained. Some creature came with the spiders. It wielded a sword of glowing moonlight, and was as tall as a house. A monster with horrifying skill. It destroyed the wall with a swing of its sword. The Legion was unprepared for the ensuing battle and we were forced into a retreat while I covered the escape. The beast. Sullivan spoke up. It wielded a weapon. It did. Solaire nodded. It glowed brightly under the moon, and cast a torrent of light into the sky before bringing it down. It sounds like they used a noble phantasm. Olga put on a thoughtful expression. Were you able to catch what they said? I did not. Solaire shook his head. Their cry of their skill was as much a scream of pain as anything else. I am not confident I could defeat it under the cover of night. The situation escalated when Vort arrived to aid the beast. How did you get away? Nero asked. You are spinning quite the dour tale for us. A passing friend. Solaire's tone changed to jovial again. He is traveling with us to our next fortification with the remnants of the 6th Legion. He called himself a passing hunter by the name of Lucian. A rather stern fellow, not much for smiling, but he's pleasant enough company. Is he a servant? Indeed. Solaire nodded. He referred to himself as foreigner, although I confess, I do not understand the term myself. Neither do I. Romani cupped his chin. We know about a few of the extra classes, but I've never heard of a foreigner before. He shook his head. Did you recognize the name of our good friend? I do not. Solaire shook his head, but we have more news, caught on by the town we are currently residing in. News. Nero titled her. What news? Apparently a lord is currently residing on one of the islands. Solaire chuckled. They had been residing there when the crisis against the Saint of the Deep had just begun, although all attempts to reach the island have failed. Mind you, those have been attempts from the spiders themselves. Why? Apparently the ships are being sunk. Solaire explained with a shrug. I don't know myself, and I'm not certain why a lord would live alone on an island. A lord. Nero frowned, like a foreign noble. He means a god. Sullivan growled out, although I am not surprised they would hide there, and I suspect Aldrich is soon to be aware of their existence. That's bad. Ritska blanched. That's very bad. Why? Nero turned to Ritska with a confused expression. The young boy cringed and looked away. Aldrich has a penchant for consuming gods. Sullivan dryly explained. He did so with Gwyndolin, and should he get his hands on this lord, he shall do so with them. Nero made a face like she sucked a lemon. How disgusting. Repugnant even. She shook her head. Then it is clear what we must do. We shall recruit this god. Quote. What? Sullivan turned to her. I am seeing a jump in logic. I was to suggest we kill them before Aldrich can consume them for their power. What? Kill a god? Are you perhaps a fool? Do you wish to invite curses upon us all? Nero looked aghast. No. We shall sail to this god's island and convince them to aid us. Or rather, I shall. I am certain my beauty will entrance them into acting. Lords are fickle and arrogant. Sullivan bluntly surmised, it would be better to kill them. I am of the side of the emperor. Solaire interrupted, we should recruit this lord to our aid, surely they would recognize the common threat we all face. You overestimate lords. Sullivan retorted, however, I will not waste time arguing over a lost cause, but I shall have no part of this foolishness. Can we even afford a detour? Olga asked. Moving to meet up with a god would take away servants to deal with the current issue. She crossed her arms. If there are more servants here, then if they decide to attack, we will need to be present to repel them. We have two groups now, don't we? Ritska suggested. I could go to the god. Absolutely not. Olga shut him down. You are far too valuable to allow that to happen, she scoffed. Ah, then you shall you then. Nero beamed at her. Olga sputtered and looked at the emperor in shock. But I. You have your bodyguard too. Nero smiled at her widely. I can travel and meet up if needs be. Solaire interjected, if young Ritska brings his servants to our location, he and Lucian can begin their advance across Rome and the two groups can link up once the aid of the god has been secured. Nero nodded her head, turning to Ritska, and I shall join you. Ritska blinked at her, that's way too dangerous. You're the emperor. What if something happens to you? Nonsense. Nero waved him off. I am the flower of Rome. I shan't allow my empire to face danger and do nothing. So, let me try and understand this. Romani called the group's attention to him. Director is going to meet up with a divine spirit while Fujimaru and the emperor are going to head into a land filled with spiders and monsters to find a guy who eats gods for breakfast, right? Quote. Yes, Romani. Olga sighed. You have once again demonstrated why we keep you around. Really? The doctor blinked. I thought I was just stating the obvi. Oh. I see. The man slumped in his seat. And what shall you be doing? Nero turned to Sullivan. The caster stared down at her. I have no desire to remain with the unkindled, nor do I desire to make merry with a lord. He released a tired sigh. However, it appears I have no alternative. He turned to Olga. I shall travel with you, and withhold judgment of the god until I meet with them. He paused, however, should they refuse to leave, I will strongly recommend killing them to deprive Aldrich of possible power. I suspect it shan't come to that. Solaire sternly interrupted him, nor would I allow you to cut down one who has yet to act dishonorably. HMPH. UMU. Nero beamed, the plan is settled then. And, yep, we're splitting into two groups, one off to the islands and one into Gaul. But if some could guess earlier, the island of the god does have a guardian to it. But anyway, we move on. Also, focused a little on some of the other characters this time, felt I was sidelining them, so they'll have their moments to shine in the upcoming chapters. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 35. Alright gang, let's split up. Ritska Group Pav. We're going into two groups. Ritska explained to his servants as they gathered around him. The director will be going with Sullivan, the emperor and the berserker outside the city to meet up with Solaire, then they'll travel down to see about this god they've been talking about. Is that wise? Ash asked, crossing his arms. Not that I do not trust sorceress Olga to be able to handle herself, but allowing her within distance of Sullivan is not something I would recommend. I concur. I would urge you to listen to reason, my liege. Verndari nodded his head. He is a renowned oathbreaker, he has admitted it himself. What assurances can he give us that he will not merely betray us when the situation arises? Metalhead is a point. Quelaag huffed, looking at her fingernails, but it's not my life I'm gambling. Well, Ritska scratched the back of his neck, we don't really have any aside from his word. Ash let out a mirthless scoff, his word. Then we have nothing. He did help us out, kind of. Ritska pointed out, he's here and not working with Aldrich. If you can't trust him to not betray us, at least trust him to not betray us right now. Ash stared at him for a few moments, then sighed and rubbed his gauntlet over his helmet. Very well. I only ask that sorceress Olga and the emperor remain cautious while dealing with him. Ritska chuckled. I think the director is already a little paranoid of everything. He coughed into his hand. Anyway, we'll be moving back north where we came from. Solaire said they picked up another servant during their escape from the city. We'll meet up with him and Legate Vespasian before we begin our, he cringed, Scooby-Doo search of the continent. Scooby-Doo. Verndari parroted with a confused tone of voice. Arash looked down at Sif and then looked away, letting out a wheezing laugh and shaking his head. Fujimaru, Romani sighed, I would like you to take this a little more seriously. Nonsense Shaggy, I'm taking this perfectly seriously. Ha! Carrie's amused laugh echoed throughout the command room, causing Romani to let out a mirthless chuckle and sent a despairing glance in her direction. Senpei. Mash whispered to him, he turned to her and raised an eyebrow, what's Scooby-Doo? Ritska stared at her for a few moments before he rested a hand on her shoulder, new plan. When we get back to Chaldea, you're going to watch some TV. Oh, she blinked, okay. Moving on. Ritska cleared his throat, turning back to the group. Quelaag and Cecilia will be coming with us. He paused, staring at Ash, unless you'd rather leave Cecilia behind. Mine wishes to follow milord. The woman spoke up, looking over to them, a soft smile forming on her face. He has always spoken of his adventures, it would be most pleasing if I were to join him. Alright, Ritska paused, but, what can you actually? He cut himself off when a perfect clone of Ash manifested next to the caster. The heads of all the servants, including Ash, turned to stare at the duplicate for a few moments. Well, never mind then. 2 servants for the price of 1, cool. I am confused as to how temperature relates to this. The woman cocked her head to the side in a rather innocent fashion. Ritska coughed into his hand. Type of expression, means nice. Ah, I understand now. Cecilia nodded, a pleased smile on her face as the copy of Ash dissipated. Ash was still staring at the spot where it had vanished before he sent a glance towards the firekeeper. Does he speak? He asked, somewhat curiously. The firekeeper shook her head. He does not, milord. I see. Weren't you going to ask about the bottomless box or something like that? Gareth asked him. The way Ash's body flinched and his release of a pained groan gave her all the answer she needed. She cringed in response. No luck then. Patches. was all she got in return. Vrindari's head turned towards him and cocked to the side. The merchant. King Vendrick issued us with an order to detain him on sight. He paused. Something relating to theft and possible murders. He apparently stole my bottomless box. Ash growled out. It means if I ever see him again, I'm going to break his fingers. Bad blood, Arash guessed. Yes. I see. Okay then. Ritska brought the group's attention back to him. So, while Director and her team are securing the possible help of a god of some variety, we're going to meet up with the foreigner, Servant Lucian, who's apparently here to help us. Foray. I have no idea either. Ritska sighed, then looked around. We're also going to need horses. Figured you'd say that. An amused voice called out from the far end of the hall they were in. The group turned to see Aulus walking towards them with a smile on his face. It seems our time to part is not yet upon us, lad. Aulus-san. Mash waved at him. Are you here to help us? Well, the man chuckled, scratching the back of his head, then handed a parchment over to Ritska. The boy took it from him, opening it up and reading through the contents before he blanched, slowly turning his head back to the centurion and giving a strained smile. Oh, was all he offered, handing the document to Mash, who had a similarly awkward reaction upon reading it. Yes. Aulus chuckled. That was my reaction as well. He scratched his forehead, the amused smile never leaving his face. The 5th cohort of the 4th Legion stands by you then, Tribune Ritska. He roughly pat the boy on the shoulder. So, ready to head out. Can I? He turned and looked over his servants. Vrindari, you've commanded people before, right? I have experience in it, my liege. The man nodded his head, crossing his arms. I assume you wish to call upon me for advice. I was actually going to delegate it to you because I've never commanded anyone before. He paused. Well, not a small army anyway. I can see the issue. The shielder gave another slow nod. However, those were commands from the Emperor herself, I assume. It would be poor form for you to delegate the entirety of the responsibility towards me. I would see this more as an opportunity for learning, my liege. With respect, Tribune. Aulus stepped forwards. It would do the men some good to meet the individual they have been assigned to. He gestured towards Vrindari, as well as his second in command. I thought Ritska was the second in command. Romani mumbled quietly. Mash sent him a small frown, although fortunately the centurion didn't appear to hear the doctor. It is up to you, Tribune. The man acquiesced. I do not hold rank to supersede you. Won't the soldiers be uncomfortable that Senpei is now in command? Mash asked, somewhat hesitantly, giving Ritska a small bow. No offense Senpei, but, you are a little young. No, I'm with you. Ritska chuckled. I'm only 16, and I probably wouldn't be comfortable following someone younger than me with less experience. The ensemble of servants behind him gave a simultaneous blink at his declaration. Aulus snorted, shaking his head. With respect, sir. You'd be hard-pressed to find a legion that didn't have 1 or 2 brats leading it. Most tribunes or prefects haven't even seen the sharp end of a gladius before. Vrindari cocked his head to the side. Is it wise to have so many inexperienced officers in an army? I'm just some pissant centurion. Aulus grunted, giving a wry smirk. I'm not going to argue with the promotion of a senator's son. Fair enough. Well, Ritska coughed, then shook his head. I suppose I don't have much of a choice. He gestured to Aulus, better go meet the men then. I'm sure it'll go fine, sir. Aulus nodded, too much respect for the emperor to argue with it. He paused, although most will think you a tactical genius considering your age. Ritska blinked, sweating, but I'm not though. Oh, I know that, and you know that. He chuckled, but they don't. Olga Group Pav. Olga was followed by her servant, the larger berserker trailing behind her as they walked through the streets towards the main gate. Nero was moving ahead of both her and Sullivan as they made their way through the streets. The woman was having flowers thrown at her as she advanced through the streets as well as compliments being shouted. Olga, for one, found the entire affair to be rather exaggerated. It was almost like watching a performance. It was unreal. She knew that Roman emperors had wanted to show off their luxurious lifestyles. But this was just ridiculous. This is pathetic. Sullivan scoffed. He looked over the streets. He'd cast his chameleon sorcery over his body to avoid a panic, thus giving him the appearance of a rather ordinary person. He was also rather blunt in his comments, once again, although he had been silent for the most part. It shall be a few hours' ride from here to the docks. Nero called back to the small group, perhaps longer, although there is one more we must collect. The construct. Sullivan surmised. Nero nodded her head, then frowned. Although I am saddened I have not thought of a name for him yet. She sighed, I'm certain I shall think of one for him. Him. If there was a personality, it has long since departed. They are an it. Sullivan rolled his false eyes, although if you insist on treating the creation like a sentient form of life. You may. The large-horned helm turned down and stared at them. Nero grinned and strode forwards, come guardian. She thrust her arms wide, we are going on an adventure. The giant stared at her for a few moments before releasing a low groan, then moving its head to stare at Olga's servant. The two suits of armor stared at each other for a few moments before the blackened suit let out another groan, turning its body and nodding once at Nero. See. She gave Sullivan a smug grin, he wishes to join us too. Yes, the golem constructed to follow orders, followed yours. Sullivan huffed, truly, there can be no greater proof of sentience. The suit of armor in question let out a threatening groan, showcasing its dislike of the comment. Sullivan turned his head and looked the armor up and down before he sighed. Distractions aside, I assume we are to depart now. Indeed. Nero nodded her head, then turned to Olga. You can communicate with your subordinate, Pale Rose. Please stop calling me that. Olga silently thought in her head while she said, yes, holding up her wrist and pressing the communicator. Romani, open a channel with Fujimaru. I can't actually do that right now. Romani replied back hesitantly. She glared at him, only causing him to sputter and throw up his arms in surrender. And now, wait a minute. I would if I could, but he's busy right now. Doing what? Giving a speech to his troops. Romani gave a nervous smile. One of Olga's eyes twitched violently before she released a breath of exasperation. I can tell him to call you back. No. Inform him that myself and the Emperor will depart. How close is Saber to our position? Which one? Solaire. Oh, right, that makes more sense. He chuckled. Well, readings are looking like he's running full pelt. Wow, that's really fast, so he'll be there within a few hours. Nero nodded. Most wonderful timing then. It must be because of the morning sun. The what? The morning sun. She elaborated. He spoke of how the sun grants him strength. Nero beamed. Perhaps he is indeed blessed by Saul. Huh. Romani mused. Well, it was said that Sir Gawain of the Round Table was blessed by the saints and was stronger under the sun. He shrugged. Maybe Solaire is a bit like that. It means they attacked during the night to kill him. Olga crossed her arms. It also means that we will need to attack during the day as well for the best chance of victory. Aldrich will, no doubt, realize this. Sullivan replied. Should we approach, he will attempt to force an outcome during the night. He turned his head away from them. Regardless, we should make haste to our destination, now that you have picked up your stray. The horned armor growled again, tightening its grip on its sword and glaring at Sullivan while the flames in its chest intensified. Olga paled and backed away. Let's not provoke the berserker servant. I was making observations. Please, don't. Ritska Group Pav. Right. Hello everyone. The master of Chaldea gave an awkward wave to the assembled Romans. The legionnaires were all staring back at him with blank expressions, which somehow made it worse. Good morning. I'm Fujimaru Ritska. He introduced himself, then pointed at Mash. This is Mash Kyrielite. The girl gave a small wave of her own. This is Arash, Gareth, Verndari, Beatrice, Cecilia, Ash, Quaylog and the wolf is Sif. Did he just out all our true names? Arash wondered with a raised eyebrow. Ash looked over at him and shrugged. Apparently they'll forget this ever happened in the first place. He whispered back, although I doubt mine holds much weight. I guess. The archer scratched his chin. Seems a little unprofessional though. He shrugged. Well, not like that bothers me all that much. I have no doubt Sorceress Olga would make her grievances with this vocal. Ash replied, but she is not currently present. Fortunate for the kid then. Arash chuckled, she's probably have some choice words. Quite so. So, I'm your new tribune, Ritska continued on, I'm here from Chaldea to help you. He snapped his fingers. If you're wondering about Quelaag. He pointed at the Chaos Witch, she's here to help us. He turned to her, aren't you? What are you doing? She asked in an incredulous tone of voice, then looked down at Mash next to her, what is he doing? Senpei is, Mash cringed, he's trying his best. He looks like an idiot. Quote. He's trying his best. TCH. She clicked her tongue in annoyance and turned to Vrindari. You're a knight, why aren't you up there embarrassing yourself? Speechcraft was never my forte. Was the answer she received, not even looking at her. Besides, my liege can use this as a learning opportunity. To what? Train for his role as court jester. Perhaps you can train for the role of court pet with your constant whining. He growled at her, hold your tongue unless you can offer some meaningful words. Oh. So the lapdog has some bark to his little bite. Quelaag smirked. I thought your role as beauty mirror to your kingdom's royalty would have dulled that nasty tone of yours. Quite unbecoming of a knight. You vile little. And those two are off again. Arash sighed, she's a little too harsh with her words, and he's not got enough patience for them. Indeed. Ash replied with a solemn nod, while I have no love for chaos witches, I can control my responses. Milord, Lady Quelaag has done no wrong. Cecilia spoke to him in a soft tone of voice, almost akin to a mother scolding a young child. Her relation to chaos should not earn thy ire. She has not earned my ire. He sighed. I simply do not like her, that does not mean I hate her. Milord, Cecilia smiled at him, thou does not believe Lady Quelaag born in such a state. No, but that means she has suffered punishment for her family's crimes. He replied, I am neutral towards her. Some problem back home I take it. Arash raised his eyebrow at the pair, Ash turned to him and nodded. A very old one. He replied, rubbing the brow of his helm, although, I should let go of my anger, she has been dead to me for millennia regardless. Arash shrugged, don't know all that much about it, so I can't comment on it. He turned his head back to the arguing pair, although someone should probably the valiant knights of Gareth and Mash to the rescue. He chuckled, the two knight servants had now gotten involved, attempting to disarm the argument between the Chaos Witch and Vrindari. Arash looked back to Ritska, the boy looking far for awkward as the raised voices of his servants echoed out behind him, attracting the divided attention of the Roman cohort. Most looking between him and the argument behind him. This is getting out of hand. The archer frowned, standing up, should probably do something. Indeed. Ash nodded, standing up, casting a glance to Cecilia, we'll be back soon. He responded, she gave a nod in response as he and Arash made their way to the volatile gathering. Which is why we'll be going out. Ritska flinched as the voices behind him interrupted him again. OTB insulted by some filth. Going out to the Gaulish territory and time polishing your sword. We'll be joining up with Mabarasing Senpei. Ritska sighed, turning around to finally face the catastrophe happening behind him. Oi! He shouted at them, the servants paused as one, turning their attention to him. I'm trying to motivate these guys and not come across like some hick and you're making us look like a pack of idiots. The servants untangled themselves, Quelaag scoffing and backing away while Vrindari bowed his head in apology and took a step back. Thank you. He huffed, turning back around. Anyway. He coughed into his hands. So, best of luck guys, any questions? Vrindari slammed his palm into his face. Olga Group Pav. That's quite the expression you are making, pale rose. Nero noted, staring at Olga with a look of confusion, are you well? Olga blinked, the scowl on her face turning into an annoyed frown, I don't know. I had the feeling of indescribable rage a moment ago. Nero shrugged, I confess, the human mind is a mystery to me. She looked longingly at the sky, to think that there are people out there who do not recognize my beauty. Olga's head slowly fell into her hands, she felt like crying. I'm never coming on another race shift again. She promised herself, I can't handle this. It's too stupid. Ritska Group Pav. I think it went well. Ritska clapped his hands together, a nervous smile on his face as he approached Mash, got my point across, right? Mash and Beatrice turned to each other, the latter turned back to him. Master. It could have been worse. She went with, giving him a confident smile. If I had done it, it would have been worse. Ah. He chuckled. I'm sure you'd do fine, Betty. Be Betty. The woman blushed and recoiled. The amused laughter of Arash briefly rang out across the camp. Ah. Ritska blinked. Sorry. I might have gotten a little too friendly there. He chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his neck. I can call you Beatrice if you. No. She waved her right hand while her left pulled down her hat to cover her face. It's fine. You can call me Betty if you want. All right then. Ritska shrugged, then looked back at Mash. So, the speech went well. Quote. You tried your best, senpai. Mash responded with a genuine smile. Ritska recognized that kind of smile all too well. It was the kind his mother gave him whenever he was terrible at something, but she wanted to spare his feelings. Quote. That bad, huh? His shoulders slumped. Mash winced. It wasn't. That was fucking awful. Aulus declared, even without whatever theater was happening behind you. He gestured at the servants with his chin. On the plus, the men are quite entertained, which is good. Is it? Well, none of us want to die miserable. Quote. They think they are going to die. After whatever that was. He crossed his arms and nodded his head. Oh, yes. Tribune. He scratched his helmet. Do you have any orders to relay to the troops? Just. He sighed. Follow whatever Verndari says. He waved the man off, looking crestfallen. Tribune. Aulus nodded and moved off, shouting out to the troops. I should practice making speeches. Ritska pinched the bridge of his nose. I was never good at group presentations. I'm sure you'll get better, senpai. Mash offered, patting him on the back. Ritska sent her a grateful smile. Thanks, Mash. He chuckled, then looked around. Well. We'd best get ready to go, shouldn't we? It's a few days' ride to meet up with the legate, so we should probably head out. Yes, senpai. Olga Group poved several hours later. If the winds are fortunate, we shall be there by tomorrow. Nero announced, and how could they be anything but fair with me at the helm? Quote. Has she experienced sailing? Soler asked Sullivan, his voice edging on concern. The caster looked away from his book and towards the night. She claimed that she was emperor and nothing was beyond her skill. He replied in a dry tone of voice, so I would recommend preparing for the worst. He returned his attention to his book. It is why the constructs have retreated below deck for the time being. I see. Soler nodded his head slowly, and then walked away from the caster servant, seating himself down next to Olga. She cast him a sideways glance and raised an eyebrow at him. What are you doing? Sitting down. Why next to me? Because it would be terribly lonely to be sat by oneself with so few around. Soler replied back evenly. I also find myself in dire need of a conversationalist. Caster Sullivan is far too, well. I have met more trustworthy mimics. He chuckled. Her blank look told him she had no idea what he was talking about. He awkwardly coughed, and while the emperor is certainly a personality, she's nothing but personality. Olga huffed, leaning back against the railings of the ship and closing her eyes, and I'm stuck with her trying to make moves on me. Well, Soler shrugged, there are worse courting partners. I'm not looking for a courting partner. Olga hissed in despair, I'm looking for a reliable subordinate. Her head fell into her hands. At least Berserker listens to me, but he's a golem, he doesn't count. He. Quote. Them, I don't care anymore, she sighed, he's just Berserker, and doesn't even have a name. Quote. Well, you could always. No. Very well. Soler acquiesced, although you seem to be doing rather well despite it, the nobles of Astora would not even grace the front lines. He shrugged, then again, they weren't too many trained in the art of the sword. Quote. Noble. You are you not? Soler looked back down at her, you carry yourself similar to one, although, he chuckled, you're far too caring for that. Wah! She gaped at him, then glared although it was offset by a blush of embarrassment. I am how dare. If you did not care, your first instinct would not have been to ensure the well-being of your subordinate. That is, she scowled and looked away. He is my responsibility. As director of Chaldea, it is my duty to ensure the safeguard of my employees, that is all there is to it. Solaire's quiet chuckle continued, much to her chagrin. The ship suddenly lurched, Olga and Solaire being sent face first onto the deck, the knight shooting to his feet, gently helping the director to hers as well. What's wrong? She looked around in a fright. Are we under attack? The Emperor can't steer. Sullivan's calm voice informed them. The pair turned to see he had hardly moved from his spot, still indulged in reading his book. I would advise you to brace yourselves, I suspect this shall only get worse. The ship lurched again. Ritska Group Pav. It's merely that the bows I used were much larger. Ash replied with a shrug. They did not rely on aiming specifically. You could point the arrow and they were either too slow to avoid it, or it had an area of effect. Area of, Arash raised an eyebrow at him. How big were the arrows? Depends, he replied. I used great bows, sometimes. I wasn't very good at it, but I only ever really aimed it at bridges, or stationary targets. That doesn't answer my question. No. The arrows were. He frowned. Well, the size of a long sword? No. A bastard sword? He nodded his head. Yes, a bastard sword. What the heck kind of arrow is that? Arash gave him an incredulous look. You may as well just throw spears at them at that point. They were designed to hunt dragons. Ash pointed out. They are supposed to be large. Yes, but you weren't hunting dragons with them, were you? No. I was trapped in a cavern with one. Ash scratched the top of his helm. I doubt Madir would have given me enough time. The bow had to be implanted in the ground, the string was made of what felt like steel and the arrow was quite heavy. In the time it took me to draw back the bow, Madir would have already cleared the chasm and, well. He was a big dragon. And you were a guy in heavy armor. Arash surmised. How often did he kill you then? Oh, nearly, a few dozen times. You seem rather calm about dying so often. Once it happens the first 10 times you get used to the idea of it. Does it hurt? Every time. Ash gave a bitter chuckle, and there are no limits to the creative ways that Lothric can kill you. I've been burnt, stabbed, ripped in half, eaten, fallen to my death numerous times, poisoned. Poison. Arash blinked. How can you die of poisoning? Most poisons I encountered were the fast-acting kind which destroy the muscles. Ash explained. Unkindled and undead are also, well, our bodies are still human at the end of the day. Just because stabbing me through the heart won't immediately kill me does not mean I wouldn't die. Sounds rough. It's just the way things were. Ash bluntly put, was the way things were for a long time, complaining about it wouldn't have changed much. Any idea how things go so bad? Anyone who did would have gone hollow and died a long time ago. Ash gave a mirthless huff. The chaos which would know, but the only reason I know her was through reputation. The birth of demons was an act which was never truly forgotten. Well, Arash clapped him on the shoulder. At least you're here helping these guys, right? Well, Ash smiled behind his helmet. There is that. I don't think you can quite grasp the notion I feel now. If I were to die, I would stay dead. Seems pretty alien to you. Arash laughed. Then again, we're all technically undead now. Well, none of us are really alive, we all died years ago. I suppose that is true. Because it's a big fucking wolf. Aulus grunted, staring at the animal. I just want to know how much of our rations we're gonna have to set aside for it. He does not need to consume your rations. Vrindari sighed. He can sustain himself in other methods. It's the other methods I'm worrying about, sir. The man explained. We kind of need the horses. Vrindari turned his head and looked at the centurion. We will provide for Sif out of our own rations. The wolf will pose no danger to your horses or the injured. Right. Aulus let out a sigh of relief. Thank you, sir. HMPH. Vrindari grunted as the man turned away and walked off. Gareth looked at his departing person before turning to look at the knight. You know Sif doesn't actually need to eat, right? I am aware. Vrindari nodded. I am also aware of yours and the paladin's raid on the pantry. Gareth began to nervously sweat. As such, Sif now has an expectation for food. The wolf snorted, causing Vrindari to deadpan at it behind his helmet before looking back to the lancer. And I would rather he consume the food we have, as opposed to the animals we need. He paused, unless he plans to hunt for deer. Sif's head tilted to the side as he seemingly thought the process over in his head, giving a slow nod as if he approved of the idea. Huh, Gareth pat the wolf on the head. You like the sound of a hunt, boy. Whether or not we discover game, however, is an entirely different issue. The looking glass knight went on, but that is a concern for later. I suppose. Gareth mused, what do you think about the servant Solaire spoke about? This. Lucian. Verndari quizzed. I have no thoughts, I have not yet met the man, so I cannot comment on whether or not he is trustworthy. For now, I shall maintain the view that we should keep a close eye on him after we encounter him, as well as determine his motives. That seems to be a bit cautious. Gareth pointed out, he did help Solaire. His motives for aiding Solaire remain a mystery. Verndari countered, thus, we cannot trust his goodwill. I am not demanding an interrogation, merely that we have a basic understanding of where we stand with this potential ally. Ah, that makes more sense. She nodded. One more thing. Verndari turned to her, I have been meaning to ask, were there many female knights in your kingdom? It is simply that Drangulik did not have them, so I assumed your kingdom had a different approach. Oh, no. She shook her head, I disguised myself as a boy. A boy. Yes. You. Yep. What? Was anyone aware? The knights and the king knew. She replied, although, the people, less so. She winced, you couldn't really have girl knights, so I had to disguise myself. I see, he slowly nodded his head, and this disguise, he gestured at her. Worked. It never got brought up. She replied, why? No reason. Verndari turned away from her, it was probably her youthful visage that made people assume she was just a young boy rather than a girl, and he would have had certain reservations about the intelligence of the kingdom if they could not tell boy from girl from that appearance. And you place a conductor this coin into the catalyst and, she held it up with a grin, there you go. One catalyst made of sticks. Whoa, Ritska gently took the long staff from her hands and held it up, I can't actually use sorcery, but this feels pretty cool. He giggled, I feel like Gandalf. Who? Damn, Ritska cursed, I'm going to have to get people to watch movies, aren't I? He paused, wait a second. He flashed up his communicator, hey, Romani. Huh. The man blinked, turning away from his other screen, what's up Fujimaru? You need something. He gave a nervous smile, his eyes flicking to and from something off screen. Romani. Ritska asked, raising an eyebrow, what are you doing? Nothing. Just, consulting a friend is all. Are you talking with that VTuber again? Magi Mari is more than a VTuber. Romani argued back, then cleared his throat. Anyway, did you need something? Does Chaldea have any films? Any what? Films. You know, moving pictures. I know what films are, I'm not that old. Romani sighed, but yeah, well, he chuckled, we have a lot of stuff, books, movies, TV shows. I think someone brought a games console. He looked off to the side, didn't you Carrie? How did you know about that? We do have security cameras. He gave a strained smile, the sound of someone choking went off, the director doesn't know, if that's what you're worried about. Thank Christ for that, the woman sighed, but yes. I have a console, why? Fujimaru was asking what entertainment we had, actually. He turned back to Ritska, why were you asking that? I was going to hold a movie night. He explained, MASH is sorely lacking in knowledge and I keep making references that no one gets. I get them. Roman. It's not the same. I suppose it isn't, he sighed, still. We have a few movies I wouldn't recommend showing the servants. Really? He blinked, like what? How do you think Sir Gareth would react to Monty Python? He asked with a raised eyebrow. Ritska stared at him for several moments before nodding his head. That is a good point. By the way, how's the director doing? She's fine, probably. Romani shrugged. Well, turns out Nero is sailing the boat. The Emperor can sail a boat. Ritska blinked. That's pretty impressive. She can't. What? He blinked. But, you just said that. I know. Oh, yeah. Romani gave a constipated expression. I'm kind of avoiding speaking to the director right now, you know. In case she, well, yeah. I see. Ritska coughed into his hand. I'll speak with you later then. See you. Romani waved at him as the communicator disappeared, then turned back to Beatrice. Anyway, wheel. Moving pictures. Beatrice tilted her head in a confused manner. Ritska realized his mistake in that he would somehow have to explain technology to someone who lived in the woods and was from the equivalent of medieval times. Unknown Pav. The figure stared at the approaching shape of a boat in the distance. He sighed. Another vessel approaches. 'Tis most unfortunate. He drew back an arrow, taking aim at the boat. Still, their perseverance is to be commended. He prepared to loose when another voice called out. Stay thy hand. The figure paused, the bow went slack as he turned his head to stare down at his charge. The presence of a human approaches, and another whom I must have words with. Very well. The figure nodded, although I must confess, 'tis most unusual thou attends to these matters personally. Thou art concerned. No. He shook his head, then gave a low chuckle. I merely wonder if perhaps our other guest has brought out some emotions. Can you blame me? A third voice called out. Her own voice was high-pitched although not unpleasant. When I sense humans approaching, I can hardly let an opportunity for worship slip past. The figure chuckled at her words. Thou art most demanding in attention, although 'tis only natural. I recall Lady Gwyneth. Do not. The second figure growled out. Mention her again. The serpents emerging from below his white dress hissed. The first and third figures turned to him for a few moments. Oh. The female one called out in an amused tone of voice. That's the most emotion I've seen from you. Problems with family. 'Tis none of thy concern. He straightened his posture as the snakes returned to a more passive mood. Esser Goff, I shall conceal thy presence. We shall await our guests. A surprise is it. How unexpected. You didn't strike me as a flair for the dramatic. 'Tis prudence, not theater. He replied, and wholly expected when dealing with our guest. Know them to you. Thy believe thou could forget thy betrayer's face easily. Olga Group Pav. Heavy boots slammed into the ground, kicking up sand as Berserker returned to a standing up position. The flaming suit of armor dropped down behind them before it marched forwards, scanning their environment. This is the island? Olga asked, staring at the barren expanse. You are certain of this? Indeed I am. Soler nodded, jumping from the ship onto the sand. Sullivan followed after him, although he virtually glided back to the ground. They said it was the island off the coast of Gallia. The fisherman who I spoke with claimed it had virtually appeared overnight. Quote. What? Sullivan suddenly paused, looking back at him. It manifested itself. Indeed it did. He nodded, quite surprising too. I had not thought it was. He paused, looking up. I have just noticed. Has the sun changed? What? Nero frowned at him and looked up. How peculiar. I could have sworn we were approaching night. Because we were, Sullivan spoke up, although his voice was far quieter than it had been moments ago, filled with a cold anger with an undercurrent of dread. I believe I know which god we have found. Oh. Nero turned to him and smiled. That is good news. No. We know who we are dealing with. No, it is. Before he could finish his comment, the sand around them exploded. Towering knights, nearly 3 meters tall, seemed to manifest themselves into existence around them. Clad in thick, brass-colored armor, wielding pointed tower shields in their left hands and halberds in their right. The giants slammed the shields into the ground, leveling their halberds at them like spears. Olga let out a cry of panic as she hid behind her berserker. The servant followed a similar strategy to the surrounding knights. The flaming berserker let out a threatening growl as it stepped forwards. Thy presence has been expected. A voice boomed out around them. Thou are welcome to rest here. The form of another figure, taller even than the brass knights, seemed to appear from thin air. Standing at least 8 meters tall, with dark gray skin covered by steel armor and a large pauldron of bone and feathers on his right arm, a full steel helmet stared back at them. As well as the large bow, held in the giant's hands, with an equally large arrow. The threat was rather clear. However, thou may find their rest permanent. Gwyndolin. Sullivan muttered under his breath. Big oof for the guys. Go to meet God. Find God. Sullivan killed. Yikes. Anyway. Gwyndolin and Goff. I'll include their stats in this chapter, but their dialogue in the next one. Gwyndolin. Servant. Archer. Strength. D++. Endurance. C++. Agility. D++. Mana. X. Luck. A. Noble phantasm. A+. O heretic swathed in dark. Thy sins be brought into the light. Repent in thy final moments. An eternal curse upon thee. Dark moon light. Dark moon's light. A. Anti-army, max target. 500, max range 0 to 99. Shoots arrow into the sky which is followed by a rain of arrows. False days and false nights. Thou shalt perish in the twilight. A+. Using his mastery of illusions, Gwyndolin creates a false night to empower himself or craft a false day. Class skills. Independent action. B. Magic resistance. A. Does not extend to dark or chaos magic. Divine core of a lord. X. Personal skills. Sorcery. B+. Scaled down from his caster version. Dark Sun. X. Under the moon Gwyndolin receives a boost to his physical stats by a factor of 3. Illusions. A+. Gwyndolin is a master of illusion-based magic to trick his opponents. Illusions of sentinels are also physical manifestations. Less effective than if he were a caster. Instant teleportation. A+. Beautiful figure. C. Hawkeye Goff. Servant. Archer. Strength. A++. Endurance. A+. Agility. D. Mana. C. Luck. B. Noble phantasm. A. Calamitas ruinum. A. Anti-unit max target. 10, max range. 999. Fires a charged single arrow. Despite its claim to be anti-unit, it could best be described as anti-army localized to anti-unit. Class skills. Independent action. D. Magic resistance. B. Personal skills. Hawk ring. A. Equal skill to clairvoyance. Dragon slayer. A++. Giant. A++. Natural strength to showcase his size. Carving. D. Create carvings which make sounds when thrown against hard surfaces. Charisma. C.